more, Western scientists are trying to figure out how to meaningfully work with Indigenous partners and respectfully integrate Indigenous knowledge. Though their intentions may be earnest, people with only institutional science experience may find that the realities of true reciprocal collaboration can feel complex or heavily impacted by institutional policies outside their control. A tension we've heard in conversations has to do with how to maintain good relationships with Indigenous people and communities, i.e. respecting sovereignty, while satisfying institutional requirements for data collection and use that can sometimes be at odds with what Indigenous partners want and need. And, in addition to that common thread, we also keep hearing that there is a desire to want to do this work the right way, in a way that respects sovereignty and promotes more reciprocal relationships with partners. But not everyone starts from the same place. And so a lot of folks asked us to help explore how to respect data sovereignty and what that means for collaborative science. To be clear, we as a program aren't experts in sovereignty or even data ownership. We're focused on collaborative science, what makes it work, and how it can support better decision making. We want to know how we can best support project teams who are already working with sovereign nations or who wish to do so. And we, like so many others, are learning. And as we often do, we asked our partners in the NERRS for guidance on where to start. And that led us to Sabra.
My full name is Sabra Comet. I'm the Coastal Training Program Coordinator at Slough National Estuarine Research Reserve, and I'm also a voting member of the Osage or Wajaji Nation.
To explore this topic, we teamed up with Sabra and organized a series of semi-structured interviews that began with reserve staff we knew were already actively working with or who had worked with Indigenous partners. And we weren't exactly sure what to expect when we started asking people if they had experiences they felt comfortable sharing more broadly, but it turns out that pretty much everyone we talked to had some kind of story they wanted to share, or knew someone we should talk to. It's hard to pinpoint exactly why that is, but part of that seems to align with a trend we're seeing even beyond the reserve system.
There hasn't been many spaces where, until I came to the NERRS, that I could talk or put down like really earnestly, even recent examples of mistakes or mistreads that have happened, but really being able to be honest about those and then go, basically, this is what the lessons learned are and why this needs to be talked about now versus sometime in the future. And it's just really nice to, again, keep it very positive and very forward-looking, but also not having to gloss over those past events that definitely affect, how people feel about partnering on certain types of projects. And I think also really making it more into an honest conversation of, hey, we can acknowledge that, all these very qualified scientists are really into learning about this concept that isn't necessarily new, but just hasn't been talked about, and really making it integral to anything that they do going forward. Is not so much of a side note anymore. It's more of a, oh, wow, we need to think about this now, because we're always doing so many things and so many projects. And just really seeing that emotional connection to people that I'm talking to, just like, wow, that's really exciting. I really want to do that. How do I do that?
As we wrapped up interviews and started approaching the end of the editing phase, Sabra and I sat down to talk about what we learned from those interviews and what it means for researchers now.
I mean, it sounds to me, this is near and dear to you. Do you want to say more about just kind of like how the experience has been, like compared to maybe like how it looks now, I guess, compared to how it has been in the past?
Yeah. So I think that this is not a unique experience, but just the timing worked to where when I first started going into academia from a just graduated, student with a bachelor's into, now as a professional that's been in this for about, a dozen years, there's been a really interesting evolution to where a lot of stuff that I just kind of naturally gravitated to, either through circumstance or just being a native student or a native scientist in the space, talking about either different ways of knowing or the role of tribes or indigenous knowledge. And before, it was more like, it was really hard to find my group. I mean, there was a few other native scientists in the same realms, but we were few and far between. And then it kind of moved into, I started, speaking up when I saw things that just didn't feel right. And some very wonderful mentors would then go, "Ooh, I want to hear more about that." And I'd kind of flail through trying to explain what I was seeing. And then it kind of evolved into seeing other people bringing up the topic and in this organic network building. And now it's become so much of a mainstream topic to where I go to conferences, and instead of there being maybe one thing that I can tangentially tie into these ideas of, indigenous data sovereignty or just indigenous systems guiding Western science, now it's like there's either whole tracks or a whole conference that talks about these things. And the thing that really blew me away is that it's very little retreading of the same conversations. It's continuously branching out, it's continuously evolving, and the enthusiasm has not died down, either from, the indigenous scientist side or the scientists wanting to learn more, wanting to be better.
Our interviews uncovered 3 key topic areas related to sovereignty's impact on the data and knowledge generation aspects of collaborative science: informed consent, intellectual property, and institutional review boards. We also heard some good examples and best practices that people have used to ensure good and respectful collaboration, including data sharing plans and memoranda of understanding. So today, we're going to take a closer look at those topic areas to give some more depth and context for understanding them. We hope this will be a nice complement to the written pieces that are coming later and maybe future conversations.
Yeah, so informed consent. This will bleed a little bit into the IRB, but I'll try and kind of keep this particular example more to the informed consent. So it's just that there's definitely been, general knowledge that informed consent has not always been, something that's really done, or that is, a very rare case compared to uninformed consent.
As Sabra said, there's a long history of uninformed consent being the default practice. If you want to understand informed consent better and you're looking for a place to start, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations outlines principles of free, prior, and informed consent in a manual for project practitioners, which we'll link in the description. There's a lot of content in there, but some important things to remember are that A, obtaining free, prior, informed consent is not a one-time event. It is a best practice to maintain and pursue it throughout all stages of a project. And B, although they're often shown as broken apart into 4 sections, FPIC principles are intertwined. All principles reinforce one another, and the absence of one leads to an incomplete pursuit of the others.
But one that I kind of remember in particular was, and this is more around trust building. So when I was doing interviews in along the Oregon coast for a master's project, I kind of had an idea of what I was doing. I was going off of a project that was very experimental itself when I was working as tribal staff in Northern California, and was kind of trying to replicate some of the best practices I'd learned. And one of them was when putting together both the contract of this is exactly where the data is going to go, this is exactly what's going to happen, this is what's not going to happen. I first drafted all that up and then went to each nation that I thought I was going to interview, and made sure to meet with the staff, and first went, okay, I want you to take a look at this, and if there's adjustments that need to happen, I'm totally for that. It can be adjusted just for this, or it might be something that I later decide would be good to, replicate across all the different communities. I was really leaning on their knowledge and their experience to help drive some of that. And one of the stickout cases was Grand Ronde admittedly had rather recent, I think within the last 5 years of when I was talking with them, a bad experience with academia, to where it was still very much on the extractive. Someone came in, got some information, I think a combination of oral and written, and then disappeared. And there wasn't really a benefit to the community for participating.
This is, unfortunately, a pretty common occurrence, so much so that there are a few nicknames for people who do this, including helicopter scientists and parachuting scientists. The core premise here is extraction. The idea is that scientists swoop in with ideas of research that they want to do, and they even might pitch it intentionally or not as being beneficial to the community, but they might not take the time to figure out what the community actually wants, and or they disappear after the work is done and they get what they needed. It isn't always this cut and dry, and not all partners may want to keep projects active indefinitely. When in doubt, ask your partners what they want.
And they kind of felt, a little besmirched, I guess is the word. And so they explained this coming in of just like, hey, we can't really guarantee anything. And I was like, hey, any experience is a bonus in my book. And those kinds of experiences are also very valuable for learning. So we did some initial interviews, and one of the big ones was one of the elders came forward that had a lot of clout in the community and said, I'm pretty sure that you're not going to be able to turn on your recorder while you're here. Both his opinion and what he was expressing is probably going to be the opinion of others was, you actively listen here and, ask your questions and we'll go over maps and everything, but then you write down after. And me not having a great memory for details was rather nervous about that, but I had to remind myself that is in some communities a very strict practice. And it's basically a vetting for if you want to be a knowledge holder, you have to train yourself up a certain way. And so it was this whole practice of them both vetting, but also training me. And then them also basically holding to certain practices so that they felt comfortable participating. Ultimately, the trust building process was not going to be able to happen within the timeline of a master's project. It would have had to be either a PhD or permanent staff, which was fine. And that's actually was the big conclusion for that community in the project was there's information that they want to share, but you have to have the point person be in that capacity. You can't keep on sending short-term students like me in.
Okay.
And that was actually one of the more valuable lessons I think I got through the whole thing was making sure that you're going in with the right prep. And it can be very different than what you were expecting, but making sure that the intent and the person themselves is very clear when going in is the only reason why I didn't get the door shut in my face. I think it was actually very generous of that community to even have the detailed conversations that we did have because of the missteps very recently from another entity. I know that's kind of a sideways example of informed consent.
I think it's relevant.
But I thought it was something that is really hard to stress out in a lot of circumstances, but it's something that I've really carried forward in a lot of other spaces.
Sure.
Making sure that, hey, let's have this conversation of, overall, is this going to be something that works for your community? And not necessarily, shutting it down if it doesn't, but just going like, hey, what can we do that is comfortable for you, but making sure that the prep is appropriate. Like, where's that data going to go? What contracts are going to be made between people, between entities? Because there was both. There was myself giving my word that it would be used in a certain way, which I know a lot of people don't feel comfortable doing. And then there was the agreements between the entities of this is where the information is going to be, this is where it's not going to be.
Okay, we're going to change gears now and talk about intellectual property for a bit. And one thing to note is that it's really complicated. So here's just a really high-level explanation of some of those terms. U.S. law describes intellectual property rights as protections for individual creativity that expand upon already established innovations in science, industry, or the arts. Intellectual property typically falls into one of two categories: copyright or industrial property. Copyright laws cover the intellectual, literary, and artistic expressions such as narratives, poems, plays, paintings, music, and photography of an individual or non-governmental organization, and they regulate how such expressions can be shared. Industrial property rights encompass private ownership of both technological or operational innovation via patents for products or processes, as well as industrial and commercial branding via company trademarks and design rights. You might have noticed some key problems already. For starters, in both cases above, the protections afforded by these laws rely on a structure of individual ownership that offers fewer protections in the specific contexts of indigenous communities. The current system of intellectual property rights is designed to protect and promote industrial and commercial practices that often oppose models of collective ownership and models to which the concept of ownership does not apply. Here's Sabra to explain more.
The way that I've had to kind of condense it into talks when I've given to classrooms to where we were kind of going through it generally, but a note that I always make sure to say is it's an outdated term, but traditional ecological knowledge, TEK, does not fall under copyright or intellectual property laws. And I usually see a couple of eyes widen in the classroom at that point. And it's because it's this very amorphous knowledge holders are not knowledge owners. It's more of certain types of information really are more acceptable for, broader knowledge. It might be just within the community, it might be the community, and then others. But then there's plenty of things that there might be one family that is really responsible for that knowledge and making sure that it's kept non-written usually in some form. And those are the people that speak up when something might impact a certain place, a certain ceremony or resource, and just say, hey, not a good idea. But this very much fighting the thing of, and I had to relearn this myself, of not everything is my business. And that's very much different than the Western science view, which is knowledge is to be shared. The whole reason why we're scientists is to find out knowledge and to gather knowledge and to apply it in a more or less public-facing direction. But being okay with, one, knowing that I'm not going to be privy to everything, or not everyone's going to be privy to everything, but also being totally okay with being told that's not your business, and it not being a personal front. And not taking it personally, which is, again, so antithetical to the way that mainstream America, mainstream, academia works, is something that I had to relearn going through those spaces. And I think it's one of the reasons why ownership is not, knowledge isn't owned by a single person, but there are vetting process that have to happen before you are acknowledged as a responsible holder of that information. And I think that really does not fit within the intellectual property rights. It's not the person with the most power. It's the person that is held as most responsible.
I think then also there's a tension there with the idea of this rapidly evolving concept of open data, and the idea that we should be able to make things as accessible as possible, which on the surface level sounds great and makes sense. But then you get to this point where you're like, okay, wait, this does not align well with the concept of defending sovereignty. And there's a huge tension there.
Well, unfortunately, it's because a lot of this information is around resources. I'm just going to use the blanket term resources that are limited. They aren't unlimited. So if you have things made publicly available, people who haven't been trained in how to properly use them and properly care for them for long-term sustainability can come in, and whether they intend to or not, it's not about intent, it's about how they use it. these things can go away. These very important things can be damaged, and there's all this fear around that because of the way that, especially land, has been grabbed throughout U.S. history, and it's a very valid fear, and it's weird to try and adjust that, especially when you have something as non-physical as data, but there's still that tie to the physical resource or the physical place. So it's definitely it's tied to a lot of this history, and I think a lot of people are willing to be flexible about it, but there's always this accidental gatekeeping, but it really is this thing of we're trying to protect this to make sure that it is available and useful long term and sustainably, and that the respect is there to make sure that is there for our children or grandchildren.
You want to talk about IRB stuff? Just
Yeah.
said no one ever organically.
My personal experience has been, I'm going to go back to my master's project just because I learned so much from this. I put together an IRB that, first off, applying and doing they have questions that you have to answer. They have things that you have to include. It felt very icky to where, and I totally understand why this is used, but it's very outdated in that it all stems from medical review boards and use of or in medical based projects. So if you're doing any sort of, and it could also be psychological sciences, but if you're doing any sort of work with minority groups or Native American communities or anything like that, they're seen as, I forget the technical term, but it's basically they are more vulnerable than others. And so you have to do these extra considerations. But the way that it's worded is just, it makes me feel uncomfortable.
Institutional review boards are groups that have been formally designated to review and monitor research involving human subjects. These boards have the authority to approve and disapprove research or require modifications to proposed research methods in order to secure approval. IRBs stem from medical research, eventually expanding from proposed practices to formal regulations for the protection of human subjects in all research. According to the FDA, the core purpose of IRBs is to protect the privacy, rights, and welfare of human subjects in research. Chances are, if you've ever done any kind of research that interacted with people, especially social science research, an IRB was involved at some point. Lots of people probably already know that, but what might be less known is that many IRBs require additional protections and considerations in research applications working with tribal and indigenous communities. And many tribes and communities have their own institutional review board processes that researchers need to complete in order to work with them. Fast forward some more, and IRBs are being implemented in research settings across the country, not just medical settings. So what does this look like? Turns out it's an imperfect system.
The stuff that I was doing was more of, I'm asking about use of marine species to make sure that protected areas that we're going in, we're not going to negatively impact things. And also that if those borders were expanded or amended, that there was basically some yellow flags set up of like, hey, if you go near this area, you really need to talk to this community because there's this really important area, but still keeping a vague flag of just like making sure that the alert was put up, but that the sensitive information wasn't necessarily going to be there. And also just to help build some camaraderie between this marine protected area baseline group that was very new and some of these indigenous communities, because what I heard from both sides was the rollout for both community impacts, but also like what was going on had been very rocky. So making sure that information was going to be shared better going forward and kind of figuring out like how to do that. So not going on beyond just the writing for having to phrase things some very uncomfortable ways because of the way that the IRB was set up, and also treating the indigenous communities like, oh, we need to look out for them because they're basically children is the way that I saw it.
Yeah.
Like they don't know how to speak up for themselves, or they don't know how to advocate for themselves. So we need to make sure that we do it for them. And it's just like, ugh.
Yeah.
But going beyond that, it actually spurred the need for a separate. I actually think I put together 3 different versions of a data sharing plan and contract, again, between me as an individual and each person I interviewed as an individual, and then making sure that again, where the data was going to be, what was going to happen to it, as well as who was responsible for what was outlined, so that the entities were also held accountable to some degree. The entities that were funding me, as well as my university, as well as the tribe. Each tribe had basically signed on and said, yes, we are okay with this from our respect, but then always giving the tribal member, the participant, an out of, at any point you can say stop, or if up until a certain point afterwards you went, ooh, I really don't want that included, they could, go like, hey, actually, I don't feel comfortable about that. And all of the interviews were completely voluntary. There was no one being pressured, even by monetary incentives. I made sure to keep that out.
Side note, monetary incentives aren't necessarily synonymous with gift giving, which is another best practice identified by folks in the reserve system, especially when you're engaging with Indigenous partners. Some people, commonly including staff at tribal, federal, state, or local government agency positions, might not be able to accept monetary gifts, but can accept non-monetary gifts. The type of gift you should give varies widely, but I asked one person what kinds of gifts are best, and they suggested gifts from your place, which I think is generally a good way to go if you're at a loss. But in general, my favorite piece of advice I've ever heard, which came from the same person, is the only way to do it wrong is not to do it. But back to IRBs.
Some tribes had a very robust or already detailed research approval process, and some didn't. But making sure that not having that process was not going to negatively impact that nation over the one that had that process. So making sure that if I had to tighten up something for one community, that I tightened it up for all of them, if appropriate. And there was just all these nuances that the IRB process really there was really no room in it. I had to do a lot of exemptions. I had to do a lot of extra negotiations. I had to work basically and tell the university a couple of times, or my advisors a couple of times, that no, either that's not appropriate, or that information is not going to be available in the larger report, or no, that piece of information is not going to be asked. There's a lot of times, which is terrifying as a student, to where I just found all these things in the IRB process. I was just like, yeah, that might be the way it's written, but it's really not appropriate for this, and it's going to actually damage the relationship or any hopes of trying to work on this or subsequent things going forward. On the other hand, I'm really glad that some parts of the IRB did exist for people that came in and did not already have a lot of the background knowledge that I had. It could alert them to, oh, wait, I really need to investigate this more, or, oh, wait, I should probably consider that more before just jumping in.
So where do we go from here? It sounds like these situations can be so complicated, and there's so much room to fail, that it might be tempting to give up before even starting. And it might seem overwhelming, but this is doable. And according to Sabra, a good starting point is learning some history.
And that was one interesting thing that I was heavily coerced into doing, and I'm really glad that I did, was making sure that I knew some of the history before I really started talking with the individual tribes, and especially the non-staff tribal members. And so, I mean, it took a little bit finding the right resources, and some of the tribal staff were like, oh, have you read this one? If you haven't, then that's a good one. But even having just made that attempt at getting to know the history, even just a little bit, really helps speed things along in the trust building process.
Mhm.
And that's one thing that
Specific resources they say you.
or like books that they were like, hey, so someone here helped guide them where to do their research or whatever, so we know it's accurate, kind of thing. Or it truly represents like the history, not just the redacted history.
Mm-hmm.
And that would definitely gave a lot of speed to the trust building process.
Other than learning history, we also talked about some other good practices and tools that support good collaboration, including data sharing plans, which outline expectations regarding data collection and use for all parties in advance, and memoranda of understanding, which are more general written agreements between two or more parties that outline each party's responsibilities. Sabra touched on data sharing agreements briefly when they were talking about IRBs and consent, but you can find more information and case examples on those and MOUs in the coming written pieces. But more than that, one of the most important things to remember is to approach these situations earnestly, with an open mind and good intentions.
So I guess one of the things that I'd like practitioners to look at this is not necessarily whether this fits within their geography or not, but more look at it from a holistic approach, not only because there are always going to be differences in circumstances and geography and history, but that we're really trying to talk more about the approach and having to, in the mindset to try and have when approaching these kinds of collaborations, especially if it's their first time. And I think that kind of similar to being what in the other circles might be called an ally, that a lot of these approaches can be applicable across a wide range of circumstances, geographies, and then you have to take, your own experience and tweak it for the case-by-case approach. And even if just talking back more to this is an ever-evolving thing of if you create a partnership with even a particular community at one point, and then say there's staff and or leadership changes, you go back a couple years in the future, the whole approach might be different. The partnership either has evolved or might be different because you're starting over with different people. So not to take this as a formulaic step-by-step way to do it, but really as this is where successes have been before. This is, some of the barriers and other things that didn't necessarily stop anything. Trying to assuage some of those uncomfortablenesses, but giving people both the tools and the nudge to go out and try this in their own space and their own specialty and their own partnerships. And I'm hoping that that is encouraging rather than looking at this as this huge unsurmountable mountain. We're just trying to give you some hiking shoes, a walking stick, and a general map of where eventually you might want to end up.